26 Second Avenue, the first temple in New York, there was a facility for Srila Prabhupada. He lived in an apartment in the back. But when the temple moved to 61 Second Avenue, which was really only 2 blocks up Second Avenue, and on the other side on the west side, there was no facility for him to stay. And so when he came through, he wasn't staying long in New York. He came from LA. He was on his way to either Europe or India, I forget what. But he was only staying in New York for 2 or 3 days. But there was no facility. So that was a problem. At the time, my childhood friend, high school friend, Jimmy Feldman, had just joined the temple. And I was living in Boston with my sister, visiting her at Boston University. And he was calling me or writing me, telling me I found this temple in the Lower East Side and the Hare Krishnas, and I'm going to join. So I came down for a quick visit to New York and visited with him, and he told me that the guru was in town. And he was staying at his father's apartment. Jimmy Feldman's father, Joe Feldman, was a very wealthy man. They had a house out in Long Island where we lived, but he also kept an apartment in the city for business reasons. It was in the Beaux-Arts building on Tudor City Place near the United Nations. So Jimmy talked his father into letting Srila Prabhupada stay in that apartment for 2-3 days. So Jimmy said, I'm on my way over there. You know, he came out of we met down the street, and he said, walk me over to the temple. I had no idea who Prabhupada was, what was going on. So when we got to the apartment, there were devotees that were assembling there, and apparently Srila Prabhupada was in the living room and giving darshan, and people were congregating. Not that many, there wasn't that many people in New York at the time, and assembling in the living room. And Jimmy came to the door, and I was with him, but I said, I can't stay, Jimmy. I'm going to just leave in a few minutes. And Prabhupada was about to begin speaking, and someone told Jimmy to come inside, and he wouldn't go in. He said, that's all right, I'll just stay here. And there was a little bit of a ruckus going on, a little bit of a commotion, because Jimmy refused to go inside the apartment. Even though it was his father's apartment, he didn't want to go mix with devotees. And I had no idea what was going on, but finally Srila Prabhupada said, what's the commotion? What's going on? What's the difficulty? And someone tried to explain that, well, Jimmy is feeling ashamed. He doesn't want, he smoked a cigarette that morning with me, and apparently he felt very ashamed to mix with the devotees. He said, I'm not worthy of being in the association. So Srila Prabhupada said, whatever you have done, I forgive you. Now come in and join us. Sit down. And I remember hearing that, and everybody went, Hari Bo, and it was wonderful, and he walked in, and then I walked out. I had to grab a ride to Boston that day. So that was the first time I ever glimpsed at Srila Prabhupada or had any experience with him. But it didn't make a real impact because I wasn't a devotee yet. I had joined about a month later, and then next time I saw Prabhupada was December. A few days later is when I got initiated there in Boston. The story of my name, there's another good story, and this was told me by Brahmananda. So apparently the day before the initiation, which was December 26th, which was also the disappearance day of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and the day before Brahmananda was speaking with Prabhupada and told him about me. He said, this young boy joined and he's my secretary, and I want him to get initiated. And I thought that we should name him Swarup Damodar, because Lord Chaitanya's secretary was Swarup Damodar, and he's been serving as my secretary. And this is what Brahmananda told me. Prabhupada looked at him and said, oh, so if he is Swarup Damodar, who are you, Lord Chaitanya? Does that make you Lord Chaitanya? And then Srila Prabhupada thought for a minute. He said, no, not Swarup Damodar, just Swarup. It's easier to remember. We'll just name him Swarup. And the famous phrase that sometimes people repeat this, that Prabhupada said, Krishna consciousness is simple for the simple, but it's hard for the crooked. He said it that day. So when he was handing me my beads, I reached out for them, and he repeated it. He said, so simple for the simple, difficult for the crooked. And then he handed me the beads, and he said, so your name is Swarup Das. When we were giving Srila Prabhupada a tour of Bhaktivedanta Book Trust warehouse in Los Angeles, this is before the building on Higuera Street. We had our facility in an old brick building on Washington Boulevard. And Srila Prabhupada arrived in LA, and we gave him a tour. And as we were nearing the mail order area, the mail order department, Srila Prabhupada was asking questions about the subscriptions, how many letters were coming. And Tamal began saying, Srila Prabhupada, Swarup, he answers all the letters and he's writing to people all over the world. And he was giving me a promotion. And many people are joining and he's doing, getting a lot of success. And so Prabhupada looked at me and smiled and said, yes, one who has Swarup has liberation. And it was also at that time that I received a very, what I consider a very important instruction, personal instruction from Srila Prabhupada. The backstory is that just a few days prior, somebody suggested to me that I make up a form letter for the mail order department. In other words, people would write in, and if they didn't have any specific questions, they just wanted some information. We had already made a 4-color catalog. Instead of, just put a form letter in, my dear so-and-so, enclosed as a catalog, thank you for your interest, and that's it. And it just didn't sit right with me, a form letter. So, and I was pondering it over a couple of days. So when Prabhupada asked about the mail order and began telling him about this membership program and that I started in the mail, he began telling me that at one time he worked for Dr. Bose, and one of his duties was handling the mail. And he said that even if the smallest inquiry would come, I would answer personally and continue to correspond until they became a customer. So there was the answer to my question. There was no further thinking about form letters. No form letters. Everybody got a personal letter, even if it was one line. Can you tell me about Krishna consciousness? Can you tell me about Hare Krishna? They got a personal letter from me. But a lot of people joined from those letters. And we also had a membership program. In fact, just before coming here, I stopped at the temple over on Watsika, and I ran into 2 people who are mail order devotees, not mail order brides, mail order devotees. One was Jagadishananda, who, when I was writing to him, he was Johnny Gunn from Coon Rapids, Minnesota, and the other one was Ratna-bhushan, and he joined with his brother, Manopriya, and they were Wayne and Mark Selzler, 1805 Assumption Drive, Bismarck, North Dakota. So a lot of people became devotees. And I like to think that I was working on commission back then, just acquiring or accruing sukriti. And unfortunately, all that credit was squandered. That sukriti credit was squandered by me over the years. I maxed out on those credit vouchers that I had from doing that service. I just felt very fortunate to have such a service. I mean, imagine going every day to your office, and all you're doing all day long is sending people books and magazines and preaching Krishna consciousness and answering their questions and finding out about them and having them join the movement. So it was a lot of fun, and we had great results. One story about Srila Prabhupada stands out in my mind more than most, I suppose because of the gravity of the situation, what was happening at the time. And I'm referring to, this was December of 1973, when my sister Manmohini's husband, Sridham, he met an untimely death, let's just say. And Srila Prabhupada was in LA, he had heard what happened, and maybe it was a week after, she and I went to speak with him in his quarters upstairs in the LA temple. And she had questions about her situation and her future. I mean, she was only 25, she had a 2-year-old daughter, and now she found herself widowed, and wanted to know, could she ever get remarried? She had questions, and valid. So I went with her, and we spoke with Srila Prabhupada. And that afternoon, actually, Srila Prabhupada spoke on such a wide range of subjects. And I only wish that there was a tape recorder running at the time, and there wasn't. So I've tried to retain intact everything that was said. But one thing in particular was when he began talking about Sridham. Sridham was Prabhupada's personal servant for some time in LA when the temple was on La Cienega. So I think it was back in '68. So Srila Prabhupada began to speak about Sridham as if like to give a eulogy. And he was saying, so he was a good boy, Sridham, he was my servant. He was driving me. At the time, Sridham had a convertible that he joined the movement with. And so he would drive Prabhupada around LA in this convertible. And he said he was driving me, he was cooking, he was giving massage. And one day he asked if he wanted to get married. He asked me if he could get married. And I told him, you're still young, maybe better you should wait. But he insisted, and I let him. And then he went crazy. This is how Srila Prabhupada was recalling Sridham. Then he paused, and then he said, so we know from Bhagavad-gita, Krishna gives assurance that one who is on the path of bhakti, on the path of enlightenment, If he falls down, he'll be given again opportunity in the next life. This is given in the Bhagavad-gita assurance. How did Prabhupada put it? He will be born in a big family of yogis, Brahmins, or aristocratic family where there's no impediments. So he'll be given again the opportunity to make progress on this path and finish his business. And Prabhupada paused again, and he said, but he had the opportunity in this life, and now he has to take another birth. So what is the use? So what is the use? And those words struck me like a thunderbolt. And it dawned on me that, Srila Prabhupada cared so much about us. He did not want to see us taking more births and suffer. It says that the pure devotee, his only unhappiness is seeing the unhappiness of others. And so it pained him. His mission was to deliver everyone back to Godhead. What to speak of his beloved disciples. So when he saw us falling down and falling away and wasting the most valuable opportunity, it broke his heart. And so he didn't say it out of disgust, so what is the use? He said it out of compassion. Like, why? Why waste this valuable opportunity? And so that was stayed with me and continues. I think about that all the time. 1976 summertime was the very first Ratha-yatra festival in New York City. And Srila Prabhupada was there. The temple is on West 55th Street. And I don't know how it came about, but I ended up being the driver that day. We rented a very fancy Lincoln Town car, dark blue, black Landau top. And I drove Srila Prabhupada from the temple on West 55th to the parade, which was already in progress. It had begun, I think it was on Central Park South, on Fifth Avenue, making its way down Fifth Avenue all the way to the end. And so my job was to get Srila Prabhupada in front of Subhadra's cart. Then they would stop the parade. Srila Prabhupada would get out of the car, climb onto the cart, and stay there for the rest of the procession. So on the way to the parade, let's see, in the car was, I was driving, Tamal was sitting next to me in the passenger seat, and in the back was Srila Prabhupada, I'm trying to remember, Brahmananda and Kirtanananda. Okay, that's who was in the car. And so Srila Prabhupada asked, as we pulled away from West 55th Street, he asked what's the plan for the day. And Kirtanananda said, Srila Prabhupada, we're going to drop you on at the cart. And then at the end of the parade, at the end of Fifth Avenue, Washington Square Park is where we will have the festival. And there are booths there are tents, there's a stage set up where you'll be speaking from. We'll have kirtan, where we'll be distributing prasadam. So that's the way the day is planned. And Srila Prabhupada was listening, and I kept adjusting my rearview mirror to watch his expressions. And Tamal kept giving me dirty looks and saying, Swarup, watch the road, watch the road. And Prabhupada was quiet for a while, and then he began recalling how he said, in the beginning, in the early days, I used to go by myself to Tompkins Square Park, and I would chant, and very often the police would come and harass me. They would tell me to move or to stop chanting, that I was obstructing the pathway, or I was disturbing the peace. And so the police would make me stop. And so Kirtanananda said, well, I think it was Brahmananda said, well, Srila Prabhupada, today the police will be there at the park, but they'll be there to make sure no one disturbs you, no one disturbs us. We have a permit. The park is ours all day long. And then I think it was Kirtanananda said, well, Srila Prabhupada, I think it's safe to say that today you have conquered New York. And then I chimed in and I said, and Prabhupada, when you conquer New York, you've conquered the world. And Srila Prabhupada laughed and he said, yes, that was my thinking from the very start. Let me go to New York and start my mission there. It was the most important city in the world. So it was nice. It was nice that Prabhupada was thinking like that. First, they were throwing me out of the park, and now, he was the main attraction. On a morning walk with Srila Prabhupada in Vrindavan in India, this was August of Janmashtami time, 1974. I think it was Janmashtami morning. Anyway, it was very hot. It's always hot in the summertime in Vrindavan. The flies were very, especially then, for some reason, very aggressive. And just very intense and driving everyone nuts. So we were on this morning walk, and as the sun was coming up, it was getting hotter and hotter, and the flies were becoming more and more active. And finally, I got so frustrated and exasperated. I turned to Prabhupada and I said, Srila Prabhupada, are there flies in the spiritual world? And he said, yes, but they're not bothersome like these flies. And when they buzz, they're chanting Hare Krishna. So that was a good enough answer for me. I was able to tolerate the flies a little better after that. As soon as the words came out of my mouth, I felt like, oh my God, did I really just ask that question? Are there flies in the spiritual world? It was valid, and there are. What was supposed to be the grand opening of the Krishna Balaram Mandir in August of 1974. And I decided it was my turn to go to India. People had been going, the first wave of devotees went some years back, and people had gone to the Mayapur for Gaur Purnima the year before that. I had not yet made my initial trip to India, so I decided, all right, I'll go for this grand opening. And so the way I bought my ticket was LA, New York, then New York to India. But I decided I'll spend some days in New York. So while I was in New York waiting to board my next flight, I found out that Srila Prabhupada had arrived in Vrindavan, and he looked around and decided that the Krishna Balaram Mandir was not ready for a grand opening. The guest house wasn't finished. There was so much more construction that needed to be done. He called the festival off. But I was already in New York. I used the first part of my ticket. I figured, well, why not? Let me just go anyway. So off I went, and I arrived there in Vrindavan. It was a couple of days before Janmashtami. And it was nice because there weren't many people there. There was no festival. Otherwise, there would have been hundreds and hundreds of devotees there. So it translated into me having some more personal association with Srila Prabhupada. So, well, especially the fact that the first afternoon I was there, I happened to be standing outside of Srila Prabhupada's room as he came downstairs to give darshan. Every day he would have some darshan with the local people in Vrindavan. Palika came out of the kitchen or the pujari room with the garland and said, here, Swarup, give this to Srila Prabhupada. And already there were some elderly gentlemen sitting in the room, and Srila Prabhupada was sitting behind his desk, and they were talking. So I walked in, I put the garland on Srila Prabhupada, bowed down, gave my obeisances, and as I was walking out, Srila Prabhupada said, no, you can stay, sit down. And so I sat against the back wall, and I just watched. I watched and observed how Srila Prabhupada was interacting with these gentlemen. I had no idea who was who. Maybe some were his godbrothers. They were just people he knew from Vrindavan when he was living there. They all seemed, they were Brijbasis, very, pious, wonderful, old elderly gentlemen. And most of the talking was in Hindi or Bengali. Actually, it was Bengali mostly, except now and then I'd hear a verse in Sanskrit that I'd recognize. And I noticed how Srila Prabhupada would go in and out. He'd be just joking with them, talking very casually, and then he would get serious and quote, a verse that I recognize from Srimad Bhagavatam or Bhagavad-gita. And I realized that although all of us, his disciples, we had so much awe and reverence for Srila Prabhupada, I mean, just the fact that he was so much older than us. We always refer to Prabhupada as our spiritual father, but in reality, he was more the age of our grandparents. As a matter of fact, coincidentally, Srila Prabhupada was born the same exact day as my maternal grandpa, Abe, September 1st, 1896. But what I was noticing in the room is that these were gentlemen of his age and his generation, but they gave so much respect for Srila Prabhupada. There was a friendly exchanges. I could tell they were like reminiscing, just joking and talking, casual talk. But they were giving so much respect to Srila Prabhupada and recognizing his stature, his status. And it was nice to see. I realized that Srila Prabhupada's reputation, who he was, did not go unnoticed among the Brijbasis, among his godbrothers, because even by then, by 1974, his accomplishments were phenomenal. It was 9 years into ISKCON, not even 8, from 66 to 74, and what he had accomplished in just those 8 years was unbelievable. He was conquering the world. He was like a transcendental Alexander the Great. And so when he went back to India with his dancing white elephants, it was he was given this due respect, even by his old friends in Vrindavan. And it was nice to witness those exchanges in that room. Summer of 1971, Srila Prabhupada had arrived in Boston. He stayed in Boston for a while, then went to New York. So many people were initiated that summer. So many people have been joining. And so that was the time when reservations were made for him at a hotel, and he didn't want to go to the hotel. He ended up going back to the temple, although Swarup claimed there wasn't really any facility for him, but they made impromptu, accommodations. They emptied out one of the rooms upstairs on the second floor for Srila Prabhupada. So that day was, I had my own vehicle. I drove up from New York. So Swarup asked me to pick up his luggage so they could just take Srila Prabhupada from the airport back to the, first to the hotel, but ended up going back to the temple. So I stayed behind and I gathered up his whatever luggage he had brought with him, his big steamer trunk that he traveled with. So I was about 20 minutes to a half hour behind everybody else who had already left the airport. So thinking everyone was going to be at that hotel, that's where I went. But nobody was at that hotel. And nobody called me because we didn't have cell phones back then. Wondering what was going on, I got into a phone booth, found out, no, come back to the temple, Prabhupada's staying at the temple. Okay, so by the time I got to the temple, and I brought the suitcases into the temple and brought them up the steps, and I knocked on the door, and I thought that there was going to be a whole room full of people, which there were when Srila Prabhupada first arrived. And I guess the darshan went on for about 20 minutes, a half hour, and then everybody left. So that's when I showed up on the scene. So I was a little taken aback when I knocked on the door and walked in, and nobody was in the room, except there was Srila Prabhupada sitting behind a table. And the room was bare because they had no time to really decorate it or do anything. Except there was one picture on the far wall, one of those Brijbasi posters, of baby Krishna, the butter thieves, knocking over the butter and yogurt, and the crawling on the floor looking beautiful. And when I walked in, Srila Prabhupada was like this. He was resting his head in his hands. And I realized he was staring across the room at that picture, staring, gazing, lovingly. And I felt like, oh my God, I broke his samadhi. I walked in like this idiot. Again, Jerry Lewis, the bellboy. Like, where do you want your suit trunk, Srila Prabhupada? And, he acknowledged my presence, and I asked him where I should put his luggage. So he gracefully, with his finger, pointed to the wall. Said, you can put it up against the wall. And like I say, it was very heavy, and I was clumsily walking across the room. And I realized after I put everything down and in place that I had entered the room and I had forgotten to offer my obeisances. So like a fool, I said, oh, whoops, sorry, Srila Prabhupada. I don't know what to say, how to act. So I got in front of the table and I bowed down, and I'm going to Mama Vishnupadaya, and Prabhupada laughed and he said, thank you very much. He said, thank you very much. He was like waiting for me to, and then he thanked me for remembering so as not to commit an offense. Then he said, get up. And I got up on my knees, I was in front of him on my knees. And once again he said, Swarup Das, I have given you a very nice name. And I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada, and thank you for he had just written me a letter a couple of weeks before that. I had gotten married in June of 71, and this was the next month. And after I got married, I sent Srila Prabhupada a donation of $50. My wife and I bought some sweaters, and he wrote me a very nice letter that said, my dear Swarup, now you are married in Krishna consciousness. That is very nice, but marriage can be risky business because too much affection for the wife, the husband can forget Krishna. But if both husband and wife remember Krishna, household life becomes Vaikuntha. Then in the next paragraph he said, in our line we have our perfect example of a householder, Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He said, such a nice householder he was, and such nice children he produced. One of them was my Guru Maharaj. So following the footsteps of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So I reminded Srila Prabhupada of what he said in the letter, and I asked him, I wanted to make a joke. I said, Prabhupada, did you mean for me to have as many children as Bhaktivinoda Thakur? Did he have 10 or 11 children? Prabhupada laughed and said, no, in this age of, then he got serious. He said, in this age, it's hard enough to support a wife and one child, two children the most. He said, that's why I recommend 2 children, no more. So it was very nice to have that exchange with Srila Prabhupada. And I realized, and I asked him if he wanted me to set up his dictating equipment, the dictaphone. And he said, no, it's late, I'm tired, I'll start working tomorrow. And I said, okay, well, Srila Prabhupada, if there's anything I can get you, anything I can do for you, I said, all right, then good night, you know. And again, I felt so stupid, so clumsy, you know. We're told that the spirit soul is 1/10,000th the tip of a hair. And here I am feeling like 190 pounds of ignorance and clumsiness. But yet Srila Prabhupada is so, his presence and his association made me feel as light as 1/10,000th the tip of a hair. So I kind of floated on a cloud out of that room, feeling very wonderful to have that just little exchange, informal exchange with Srila Prabhupada. One anecdotal story comes to mind when Srila Prabhupada was in Boston, again, Boston Temple. This was also in 1969, the time I was initiated. So many devotees had come from the East Coast temples up from DC, and there wasn't that many. At that time, I think there was only maybe a dozen centers in all of ISKCON. It was still pretty small in 69. Anyway, somebody was making oatmeal in the morning for all the devotees there, and apparently they mistook the salt for the sugar. And thinking they were putting sugar in, sweetening it, they ended up pouring a bunch of salt into it and ruining the whole thing. And so everybody had to wait for breakfast to be recooked. Anyway, word got back to Srila Prabhupada what had happened, and he made this comment. He said, just like in the process of bhakti and Krishna consciousness, a little sense gratification is all right to make it palatable. But just like in a preparation, a little salt to make the preparation palatable, but too much and the whole thing is ruined. So he gave that example that the salt was like sense gratification in Krishna consciousness. We're allowed to enjoy somewhat, you know, to make it livable, make it doable for us, but too much and it's all ruined. So that was the salt example, the analogy. Metaphors be with you. One morning there in Boston during that summer, Srila Prabhupada was getting ready to go on his morning walk, and the car that was gotten ready to take him, no one could find the keys. The keys were lost, and everybody was panicking. It was last minute. So keys just disappeared. So one of the guests, hippie guy, you know, that was staying at the temple, said, look, I have a car. I don't mind. And so he pulled around the corner with his old VW Beetle, the old bug. It was all hippied out, and it was a mess. And Srila Prabhupada got in, and the first thing Srila Prabhupada did, I mean, I wasn't in the car, I wasn't there, but I was told that he ran his finger along the dashboard, which was just very dirty and dusty, like a drill sergeant with the white glove, you know. And he said, he put his finger up and he said, everything should be cleansed. Everything belongs to Krishna. Everything should be clean. And I think the lesson there was, why, you know, of course they had the car ready for Srila Prabhupada's walk, all cleaned, but everything should be clean, not just because the guru is getting into the car this morning. Everything belongs to Krishna. Everything should be cleaned, no matter whose it is, what it's being used for. So that was what Prabhupada was telling us that morning. Everything belongs to Krishna. And he would often say cleanliness is next to godliness. We were supposed to be Brahmins. He was turning feral jungle animals into Vaishnava Brahmins. He was a miracle worker. Because that's what we were. No couth. Animals. Wild. Brahmananda used to say, he loved us even though we were unlovable. He loved us anyway. One night in particular, I was sitting in that little room in Boston. It was like a closet, and it was very cold winter of 1970. And I was sitting there with my hat on and a pea coat, I remember, like defrosting my fingers on a space heater to get going on Krishna book. We were also, at the time, doing Nectar Devotion, the 10 chapters of the second canto of Bhagavatam. So much, Prabhupada was giving us so much to work on. But Krishna book was his main priority. And I was thinking to myself, why is Srila Prabhupada want this Krishna book published? It was a summary study of the 10th canto, and one of the first things I ever read was, well, when I joined, there wasn't much literature. It was the abridged Gita and the original Bhagavatams that Prabhupada brought from India, those first 3 volumes of Canto 1. And I remember reading in the preface the instruction that one should not go to the 10th canto until they've read and realized the content of the first 9 cantos. So why is he producing these intimate stories about Krishna? But it dawned on me that in his infinite wisdom, he was in his war against impersonalism and voidism, And we had just begun saying that prayer in conjunction with the Namah Vishnu Padaya. Prabhupada gave us that prayer to say, Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nivashesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarane, appreciating the fact that Srila Prabhupada is delivering the Western countries from the disease of voidism and impersonalism. And we were all infected, even as devotees, with this impersonalism. In fact, one day a new devotee had just joined, and he said, through in Prabhupada's lectures, he's always ranting, going on about the impersonalists and the Mayavadis. I don't understand. Who are they? I said, they are us. We are them. I said, we have all have this impersonal conception before we joined, especially about into merging with the white light, and we're all one, this oneness. And even in India, they have these misconceptions of Brahman is the absolute, and Krishna is subordinate to. So Prabhupada is giving the world the personality of Godhead. So he wanted this Krishna book out on the streets in everyone's homes, so we know that Krishna is a person. These are his pastimes. This is what he looks like. This is how he spends his time. One time Prabhupada said, we can give you God's name, address, phone number, his parents' names, his friends. So in no uncertain terms, he was presenting the personality of Godhead, Krishna, with that Krishna book. And Krishna book came out at the end of 1970. And at the same time, the Radha-Krishna London album was produced by George Harrison. And at the same time, George Harrison recorded My Sweet Lord, which was flooded the airwaves in the US and in Europe. And I call it the trifecta. Those three things, the Krishna book publication, the Radha-Krishna album, London album, and My Sweet Lord, all came together around the end of 1970. And as I said before, I would be receiving the mail every day, so I could feel the pulse of how the movement was growing. And from those three things happening, it just took off. That's when ISKCON really started growing exponentially into the early 70s. And over the next couple of years, it was just expanded everywhere, all over the world, every continent. Farms were being opened up, restaurants, devotees were joining in the hundreds and thousands. But I remember that it was autumn, towards the end of 1970, all that was happening. Brahmananda came back from Japan with the Krishna book, and that was the first time big books were being distributed on Sankirtan. Yeah, they were doing it out in the West Coast. I think it was Balavanta and Keshava in San Francisco, and Karanda down in LA. You joined in LA, didn't you? No? Oh, okay. So anyway, yeah, the Krishna book was out on the street. Sometimes with the record, it was a double thing. The album, you get the album, you get the book. Get the book, you get the album. I never really asked Srila Prabhupada questions on morning walks. I got to go on many morning walks, especially in LA, because when I moved from New York, I had my own car. And in those days, I think I was the only householder with his own vehicle. So I would just drive down to the beach and join the walk. I didn't have to ask anybody. One morning, and I would usually stay in the back, because I would see people just having their first experience on a walk, let them be up close with Srila Prabhupada. And besides, at the beach especially, you can't hear much what was being said. But this particular morning was at Cheviot Hills Park, and one godbrother who was having some difficulties in his personal life, I know that was happening, and he suddenly said, Srila Prabhupada, he asked many times people would ask questions, and he said, Srila Prabhupada, I know that I've read that the soul is eternal, but is there any possibility that Krishna can create a soul and then at some point in time or for some reason or other, it no longer exists. It's extinguished. He used the word extinguished. It just goes out of existence. Could that happen? Did that ever happen? Could that ever happen? Srila Prabhupada stopped walking. He looked at him, and I could see that Prabhupada's lip curl. And Prabhupada looked at all of us and said, have any of you read my books? And I asked this one devotee, have you read my books? Have you read Bhagavad-gita? What does it say? Can anyone tell me? What does it say in the Bhagavad-gita? And just the day before, well, a few days before that, I had been memorizing verses at the second canto, those verses, especially from 12 to 22 about the nature of the soul. So I had it down in Sanskrit and English. So it was, I took the cue. So I said, yeah, Prabhupada, I know. Jayate mriyate vakadachin Nayam Bhutva Bhavitavana Bhuya Jo Nitya Shashvato Yam Purana Nahanyate Hanyamane Sarire. And then Prabhupada said in English, and wrote for the soul, and then he interrupted me and he continued. He said, so, what does that mean? And then the guy, the devotee said, so I guess the soul never dies. And Prabhupada said, yes. And then he stopped. He said one more time, read my books. Everything is in my books. Krishna Bowl came to Los Angeles in '74. It began in Dallas with the Dallas Gurukula. And the Gurukula teachers decided to do it to help the kids learn the Krishna book. They had them study chapter by chapter and then answer questions in the fashion that the quiz show of College Bowl was. So they actually had these boards set up with buzzers and a moderator to ask the questions, and teams or 4 people each were set up. Apparently even the adults in the Gurukula teachers in Dallas were taking part. So there was the kids game and then the adults. And then it started spreading to other centers, including LA. And in LA, we just took off with it. I remember Murli Vodna was the moderator, and he'd make up the questions, and the really fancy boards were built. And after the morning program in the old temple room, we would have our Krishna Bowl contests. And the community, the LA New Dwarka community, divided up into we had about 3 or 4 teams. Rameshwar and his brahmacharis. And then Jai Tirtha he was the head of one team with 3 others. And then there was the ragtag team of myself and Biragava, Chandan, and Shrudashrava. And we played Krishna Bowl every single morning. And apparently, then there was it even culminated with an all-star game in San Francisco during the San Francisco 74 Ratha-yatra, where the Dallas All-Stars played against the LA All-Stars, which consisted of myself, Jai Tirtha, Rameshwar, I forget one other person, it might have been Kuvera. We lost to Dallas. They were the scholars, Anyway, apparently a month or 2 after that, Srila Prabhupada got word that this was going on. And it was spreading like to smaller temples everywhere, all of ISKCON. We're playing Krishna Bowl. And it was kind of nice because it gave us impetus to study the books. I had an advantage because I typed 90% of Krishna book, twice over, rough copy, final copy. So I knew a lot of the stories already in my head. Anyway, Prabhupada found out about Krishna Bowl, and he nipped it in the bud, as we used to say. He nipped it. He stopped it. Not that he was angry with it. He said it wasn't necessary, especially for the children in the Dallas Gurukula. He said they shouldn't have such distractions. It's not necessary. We should stop it. We shouldn't burden them. I think he said we shouldn't tax their brains with these unnecessary things. So that was the end of the Krishna Bowl. It was just yet another circumstance where we got carried away with something, where it wasn't a question of right or wrong, just like astrology. I brought up the point to somebody recently that I saw a quote from Prabhupada in a letter and also in a purport that devotees we don't deal with astrology. We're not interested in astrology. And he specifically gave the instruction to his disciples, do not go to see astrologers. Don't get involved in astrology. Don't bother with it. So this one person who came to the defense, he began arguing with me. He said, no, you're wrong. Astrology is not bogus. It's very bona fide. It's all over the Vedic scriptures, and it was used during Krishna's. And I said, look, this is what's called a straw man argument, because I never said it was not bona fide. I never said it was bogus. I'm repeating, I put a quote on my Facebook, what Prabhupada wrote about astrology in a specific circumstance. He said, don't get distracted by this astrology. Besides which, in this age, how many people are really bona fide astrologers? So this person got all up in arms. So when I was telling him, look, don't come to me with your argument, these are words from Prabhupada. And it reminded me that Prabhupada would often do that. In fact, one time he was giving that verse out of the Bhagavad-gita, Namam Diskritino Mudha, where Krishna says, fools and rascals, don't worship me. They're mudhas, and Prabhupada was saying that unless one is a devotee, he can have no good qualities. And this one Indian man was saying, Swamiji, how you can be so harsh in judgment like that? How you can say things like this? And Prabhupada said, no, I am not saying. Krishna is saying. I have to say what Krishna says. It is not my opinion I'm giving. This is Krishna's words. So, like, take it up with him. A godbrother told me this story. I didn't have personal experience of this, but when the first wave of devotees went to India, Srila Prabhupada gave instruction to go to his room at the Radha temple where he had been staying and straighten it up, clean it out. And so this one godbrother said that in cleaning the room, he came across a piece of paper. It was just folded up. It was like a memo pad. And on that front page, Prabhupada had written a couple of things, like a to-do list. And on the very top it said, save the world from godlessness. So that was Srila Prabhupada's to-do, that was his agenda. I mean, my to-do list is, do a laundry and get an oil change today and pay my electric bill. Srila Prabhupada's to-do list was save the world from godlessness. So I always thought that was a nice story, cleaning out the Radha Damodar room for Srila Prabhupada. In considering or thinking about the qualities that most stand out or I most think of Srila Prabhupada, well, there's one quick story that really illustrates one quality of his, which is humility. One Ratha-yatra, my grandson was staying with me, Kevala, and he was about 11 or 12. He came out from Honolulu, where he grew up, and he came, we were living in Santa Cruz, and I took him up to San Francisco Ratha-yatra. On the way home, we were stuck in traffic, and he said something so revealing. He said, Grandpa, I noticed in Honolulu there are many spiritual organizations, and it's always Swami this, or Yogi that, or Baba this or that. He said, but with the Hare Krishna, it's the Hare Krishna movement, not the Bhaktivedanta movement. That Prabhupada's like in the background. And I said, Kevala, you just, in a nutshell, explained the most important quality of a pure devotee. A genuine devotee isn't promoting himself. He's giving Krishna to the world, and he's in the background. In fact, when I was answering letters as the secretary of ISKCON, sometimes it happened more than a couple of times. Someone would say, in the books I keep reading that one should find a bona fide spiritual master. Where can I find one? Srila Prabhupada was so humble that he never wrote in any of those purports, I'm your guy, I am the bona fide spiritual master. He would write it in third person. And they would ask me, where can I find one? I said, well, the author of the book, he is the pure devotee. And, before I met Srila Prabhupada, it's not that I had any, a lot of experience with other, I saw the Maharishi on TV once, this transcendental meditation. I was familiar with gurus and yogis. But when I first saw Prabhupada, what really stood out was there was no ego there. There was so pure. Of course, he embodies all 26 qualities of a devotee, but his humbleness is so genuine. Here he is, this empowered acharya, who's in no time had followers all over the world, and was leading this gigantic spiritual movement. But Prabhupada never displayed any sort of self-promoting, egotistical. When you meet somebody and right away the internal radar comes on, you can feel there's an ego there. They want to impress you, manipulate you, exploit you, use you. But with Prabhupada, you knew he just wanted to give you love of God. There was no exploitation. He didn't want anything from us. He just wanted to give us Krishna consciousness. He wanted to take us back to Godhead and see that we don't suffer anymore. Just humble, pure, loving, and compassionate. Sweetness.
Je anilo premadana karuna prachu